So you've reached that point now where you're ready to finish your quilt. You've made all of your blocks, you've picked all of your fabrics, you've done all of your designs, you've quilted, and now it's that last stage, which is the binding. And this is the point where you can make it absolutely fabulous by getting your binding right. Now I'm going to show you 3 different methods for creating your binding. The first one is the traditional method. And the important thing with the traditional method is to get really sharp mitered corners, because that's what's going to make your work look amazing. And I'm going to show you how to do it, finish it by hand and by machine. Okay, so that's method 1. Method 2 is ideal for when you haven't got quite enough fabric to bind your quilt, or you've got such beautiful fabric on the back you want to bring it on to the front. So for example, I've got this awesome spotty fabric on the back. Why not have it finish on the front as well? And I'm going to show you how you can again achieve those lovely mitered corners, because your quilt deserves to be finished beautifully, and pointed edges look so much better than slightly bulky, clumsy, rounded ones. So that's going to be the bit that makes your work really stand out. And then finally, I'm going to show you a third method, which actually introduces another color into your binding. So it's a flange binding, which means it's got an extra sort of flap of fabric that goes around the outside. And if you're a card maker, think of it as a sort of your mat and layering. And I'm going to show you how to do that as well. So 3 different ways for you to choose how to finish your beautiful quilts.
First of all, we need to work out how much binding we actually need. Well, that is relatively simple, because what you're going to do is measure around your quilt. Now, if it's a square quilt, you just need to measure along one edge and then multiply that by 4. If it is a rectangular one, measure along the longer one and the shorter one and then times by 2. Obviously, if you've got an irregular shape, then measure all the way around. And then you're going to add about 12 inches to that measurement. That will be enough to take into consideration corners and things like that. So that is going to give you the entire length that you are going to need in order to make your binding strips. Now, how many of those strips do you need to cut? Well, that is based on how long your fabric pieces actually are. So if it's the width of fabric, it's about 40 inches. If it's fat quarters, it's about 20. So you may even be using scraps and just need to keep adding and adding until you get to your measurement. So say for argument's sake, we want 100 inches of our binding, and you are cutting that the width of the fabric. You're going to take 100 inches and divide that by 40, because that's the length of the entire length of the strip that you're working with, which means you would divide 100 by 40, which gives you 2.5. Well, you can't do half strips, so you cut 3. That's as simple as that. So that will tell you how much you actually need in length. Width wise, generally quilting strips for binding are 2.5 inches wide. Okay, sometimes there's a variation in that. You may be doing different finishes. You might be working with a particularly thick wadding, in which case you might increase that a little bit to perhaps 2.75, or you might be working with a very fine wadding and reduce that back down to about 2.25. But that's how you're going to work out how many pieces you actually need. Then we're going to look at how to sew those pieces together. Now, the temptation is to get your 2 pieces of fabric, put them right sides together like this, and then simply sew across the top there. That would be a bad idea, because once you've made your binding strip, that means all of that bulk will be in one place, and when you sew your binding together, you're going to end up with a lump in it. So what we do is we take our 2 strips and we put them right sides together, but we put them at right angles to each other. Then what we're going to do is we're going to sew diagonally from one side to the other. Now, you might find it useful to mark that with a little pencil line or chalk line from one side to the other. I also let mine overhang a little bit like this. We'll trim this off, but I just find that it gives me a neater finish. So I'm going to take that along that diagonal like that, and I'm going to stitch on that line from one side to the other. I'll be using a standard stitch, normal foot, and just sewing those pieces together. So I'm just going to go to the sewing machine. So here we are, back from the sewing machine. I've sewn my diagonal line. I'm then going to grab a pair of scissors and snip off the extra just there. And then I'm going to cut rather, 1/4 of an inch from my sewn line. That further reduces bulk. Then when we open that up, you'll see that that goes fairly straight. It splits that bulk across a sort of 2-inch span. We're going to flip it over. So this is the back, and press that seam open. And then you're going to go to the ironing board and press your strip all the way along. You know, it could be 100 inches, it could be even longer, but make sure that pressed open like that with the wrong sides of the fabric together, matching up those raw edges, and press that strip all the way along like that. Now we have our piece, and it's as long as we need it to be. And you can see there, that's the inside, all pressed on the inside nice and flat. And again, give me an edge like this one. So the next thing to do is to think about how you're actually going to start your piece, because we don't want a raw edge appearing around the edge of our quilt. So what we're going to do is trim off any untidiness at the end. This is going to be the beginning of my binding. So now we're going to open that up. So this is the inside, and where we just cut the end off, so we had a nice straight edge, we're going to fold that in and finger press, and then we're going to bring that over so that the raw edges are on the right hand side, and this is the fold there, and then again press along that edge. So once you've put this onto your quilt and you've sewn all the way round, this piece will actually tuck inside there, and you'll see you get a lovely neat edge. So let's just do that. Imagine this is your quilt, and I tend to start my quilts, my binding at the bottom and not too close to a corner. You don't want to do it down here because it makes it very tricky to manage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it to about the middle, maybe slightly off center. The raw edges of my binding are here, and then this is the raw edges of my quilt. In this case, I'm doing traditional binding, which is this is the front of my quilt, and then we will actually fold it over and finish it like that. So the first step would actually be to attach that edge and pin it in place like that. Now what we would do is take it to the sewing machine, and I'm going to show you how to get lovely sharp corners on your binding as you work around, because what we want is to get a mitre, a nice neat mitre on here. If you just sew it like this, you end up with a sort of mush. You'll end up with a mush in this corner. But there is a really useful technique that's going to show you how to get a really nice sharp right angle on the bottom of your piece. Now what you will need to do at this point, and it is well worth doing, is put your walking foot on your machine, because we're working with lots of layers. and it's just going to keep it all nice and neat if all of those layers stay together. So here we are at the sewing machine, and I have put my walking foot on here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move my needle so that I've got 1/4 inch seam allowance from that edge, which I happen to know what that is on this machine. So you could also use a ruler to measure that. That will be really helpful. Then I'm going to take my quilted item to the machine, and I'm actually going to start stitching about here. Okay, I'm going to leave this open because I want to be able to tuck the fabric in there when I've finished. So I'm just going to lift up the presser foot and put the rest of it under the foot here. I'm not changing my stitch length or anything like that. I'm just using the standard stitch length. I'm using a light coloured thread so that you can see it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew with 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way here. And this is where the fabric actually finishes. I'm just going to mark that so you can see. This is the edge of my fabric. And I'm actually going to stop 1/4 inch from this end. And I'm going to sew off at 45 degrees. Okay, so let's just start stitching. Now this is a walking foot, not a running foot, so you may need to keep repositioning slightly, but we're coming along to that point, and then I'm going to lift up my presser foot, rotate, and come off at 45 degrees. And here we go. You can see that's come off at 45 degrees. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this piece of fabric and we're going to fold it so that this piece here sort of lines up with where we're going to go next. So we've still got the raw edge that's now in line, and then fold it back on itself so that it lines up with that side there. Okay, so now I have like a little flap of fabric, and I'm going to go and start right from the top edge. Sometimes when you get started, the back of the foot will actually catch on that lip. If that happens, just lift up the presser foot and then drop it down again and it will free it. And then we will continue and then again I'm going to slow as I come up to that corner point. I'm going to rotate and come off at 45 degrees. So you can see there, and then we lift this up and then down and continue in the same way as we did that other corner there, straight from the edge. Keep repositioning as you go. Remember, this is the top of the fabric and this is your binding with the right sides of the fabric out and the raw edges against the raw edges of your trimmed quilt. Coming up to that final edge. Flip up, we're almost all the way around. This is our last corner. And then flip up and back down again. Right, now this is the starting point down here. I'm going to stop before I get there. Stop before I get to the start. Right. I'm going to grab my scissors and I'm actually going to chop this off about there. So my piece has gone a bit further than I don't want to chop it here, for example. So it goes past that fold there. And then I'm going to tuck it inside that previous piece. Like that. Make it nice and smooth. And then I'm going to offset this ever so slightly. You can see just there's a little bit of extra. That means that when I fold it over, I don't get too much bulk in it. And I'm just going to now continue straight. And I want to line up with those first few stitches there. So this last little bit, I'm ignoring that hanging edge. And then come up to there and we'll do a few back stitches. Right, so we've now attached our binding all the way around. And I'm going to snip off that little bit of extra there. And then what you'll do is you will push this and press. And you see you've got a lovely straight edge here, and this will fold over onto the back. Now, traditionally, you will hand stitch the back. And you will fold it over so that it covers this stitch line like that, and just do little stitches just on the one side into the back. And when you come to the corner, as you fold that over, because we've got that little flap there and you went off at an angle, what it wants to do is create a little point. Okay, so just teasing it with my fingers there, and then folding onto the back there as well. You see we've got a lovely straight edge. And on the back here, we will have a mitre. Tuck that into the edge there. And you'll see we've got a lovely mitre on the back as well. So you can hand stitch that. That is one technique to finish it. So another way that you can finish it is actually to put this onto the back. And then this would be the front. And fold it over and then do a decorative stitch on your sewing machine to hold that in place. You could do a blanket stitch or something like that. But that would be, you would attach it to the back and fold it forward. Here we've attached it to the front and folding it back. Now the way I like to finish it is by machine. So what I will do is I will push this over. And always start and finish just, past where you started and finished. So if this has moved a bit, it will tuck inside. So I'm going to tuck that over like this. All right. And I would give it a press, but I'm just going to do this very quickly. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch in the ditch. So you want to think about the colour that you're using. Probably I would go with a dark grey or a black in this case. I'm also going to grab myself some clips at this point. This will make life a little easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold over and I'm going to start about here. So just the other side of where I'm starting. I'm going to pop a pin just to hold that flat. And then down here I'm going to pop a clip. Because what I want to have on the back is that folded over, and I'm going to stitch in that, so through there onto that. And I want to make sure that I catch it all. The danger is that you if you don't clip it, that can happen, and then you'll miss it. You'll miss the stitches. So I'm just going to curl that under with my fingers. And then we'll stop before we get to the corner because we obviously want to get a lovely mitre. But I'm going to start here, and I'm actually going to move my needle slightly to the right so that it's going to sit in here between the two. I'm going to pull my threads out to the side so when I've finished I can sew them in. All right. And then I'm going to very carefully and very slowly stitch in the ditch. And it's about taking your time, because if you do veer off a little bit, you want to stop before you veer too far. Now I would do this in the darker colour. I've got this in a pale, which means if I do meander a little bit, it's going to be very obvious. But we don't want that when you are doing this yourself. So pick the colour that's the colour of your binding so you can sew up really nice and close to it. So we're coming up to here. I don't pin all the way round because things do drift as you move along. Right, now I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to grab another pin. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that this edge is nice and sharp. So I hold a pin along the edge and fold that piece over the pin. All right, so if I just move my hands out of the way, you'll see that I just held my pin just here and then use that as an edge to fold over my mitre nice and tight, and then just fiddle with it on the back. I want to make sure all my threads are inside, and then I'm just going to pop a pin in there like that to hold it, smooth a little bit further along and add a clip. All right, so you can see I've got a lovely straight edge there. So you do want to do this as you go along rather than at the beginning, because the fabric will move. So I'm going to come up to that edge, and then I'm going to pivot, and if I've gone too far we just lift up the needle and then move back a tiny bit because I've not completed that stitch, drop that down and then continue. Now I like to use this for quilts that are going to get heavy use, so baby quilts, something that might be washed quite a lot. I'll move my pins as I move my clip as I go round, but things like placemats, I mean, it's lovely to be able to sit there and spend 3 or 4 hours hand finishing your binding, but if you don't need to, then I don't think I hand bind anything anymore. So again, I'm going to come along to this edge down here. I'm putting my pin in. So my pin is actually not being pinned into anything, but it's just holding that edge there like that. So I've got something so I can pull that nice and tight and get myself a beautiful square edge again. Then tuck those in. Tuck everything underneath and clip. And I only clip a few inches in front of where I'm stitching. So and then we'll come up to that corner again. Rotate. We'll leave that there because it gives you an idea. You can see I would stitch those ends in, but you can see because I've used a white thread, I have gone a little adrift just there. But if I'd done this with black, you wouldn't see that at all. And on the back, I've got black thread in my bobbin, and you don't see that at all either. And we've got a nice edge. If you do drift and a bit of it hasn't caught, then I'm quite happy to go back and just stitch that little extra bit onto, just do like a little couple of stitches just to hold that. So that is one way of binding your quilt. It is a traditional binding, but I finished it all by machine. You can of course hand sew it if you wish, and I have done it when I do my stitching like this. I start on the front because you don't really want to see these extra flaps on the beautiful finish on the front. But if you're using a decorative stitch, we could also have done a blanket stitch along there. That could have been quite nice, or a star or something like that in a different colour. And you can choose then whether you're going to start on the back and fold onto the front, or start on the front and fold onto the back. So that is one way that you can finish your piece. sometimes you find yourself in a position where you don't have quite enough fabric left to make your binding. It may be that you miscut it, or you ended up making something bigger, or you just really want to use your backing fabric as a binding and there's just not enough of it. So I'm going to show you a method of bringing the backing onto the front. Now, there are a number of ways of doing this, but I found some of them to just look a little bit clumsy. So I'm going to show you a method that will still give you lovely mitred corners, and it would be very hard to tell the difference between finishing this way and finishing with the traditional method. So the first thing you have to do is obviously you'll quilt your item, and then you need to trim the wadding to be the same size as the top of your quilt. Now this can be quite tricky because you've got to leave your backing in place. You mustn't cut your backing at that point. So if you are going to use this method, think about stopping quilting before you get to the edge so that you can do that, because that will make it a lot easier to cut. If you have quilted up to the edge, you're going to find it a bit more difficult, and if you've quilted onto the backing, that's actually going to show as part of your binding when you've completed it. So as I said, the first step is to cut your wadding to the same size as the front of your quilt, and then you trim the back, but you trim the back to 3/4 of an inch wide all the way around, like I have here. Now I'm going to grab an ironing mat, and you will be doing this on the ironing board. So I have an ironing mat here and a small iron to work with. So here's my iron. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take it sort of very slowly. But the first thing that you need to do is fold in the edges of your backing so that it butts up against your cut edge, and press. And I would suggest doing just a little bit at a time so that you keep it all under control. And then we're going to fold that again. It does make a very narrow but very neat binding. Press that again. Be careful, because remember, it does hold its heat quite considerably. So you can clip them or you can pin them as you go around, just like that, to hold it in place. But the bit that makes this look really good is this mitre here. So I'm going to show you how we deal with the mitre. We come up to the corner like this, and again you can use a pin to help you get your sort of straight edge, and we're going to fold that in like that and give it another press. Well, I'm going to wait for that to cool because the fabric's holding the heat, so that is quite hot. And then again we're going to tuck, like we did with this bit, tuck this in. And then pull that up, and you see again with the aid of the pin, I'm going to push that in and bring that up because I want that to be smooth. So I'll actually stick another pin just down there to help that hold in place. So grab another pin here. So I've got that, and we want this to meet up nicely at that point there. I'm going to stick another pin in it, and you see we've got a lovely sharp point and a mitred corner coming in. And then I'm going to continue pressing. So we fold the raw edge in all the way around, raw edge in. Careful not to burn yourself. I'd probably do about 6 inches at a time, maybe 6 to 10 inches, and then pin it. You don't need to pin all the way through onto the back because we're just trying to hold that lip over. So I just tend to sort of go into the wadding a little bit. And then we're coming down to another corner. So again, press all the way down. Put a pin quite close to it. Then I'm going to fold this over with that pin. The pin is lined up with the edge of my wadding, just so I've got something to sort of fold against. There we go, got a nice sharp edge there. Just give that a second to cool down. And then continue tucking the raw edge. Hang on. I'm going to hold that with the pin a little bit longer. There we go. If you need to, you could actually stick a pin through that if it's not playing nicely. There we go. Let's bring that up. Take that out, tuck it nicely there. Folding the edges in. So instead of needing to have 2.5 inch wide strip of fabric to go all the way around, you just need your backing to be at least 2 inches bigger than your front, which you should always aim for quilting anyway. I go for 2 inches either side, which means if I was to use this method, I would still trim it back to 3/4 inch. I would have this much fabric on the outside left over, and it's very, very useful. So I'm just going to give my quilt centre a bit of a quick press there, and then we continue all the way around the outside here, pinning and pressing and bringing in those mitres in the corner when we want them. So tuck. You will need a lot of pins. Just going to hold that down for a second as it cools. And then fold that up. If you find it easier, you can sort of crease that edge there before you fold it in again and bring up. So you can see this is bringing in that edging and bringing it onto the front. So that is the back in this sample, and this is the front. So what you will do then afterwards, you'll need to decide how you're actually going to stitch it down. So there's a number of things you could do. You could hand stitch it. You could slip stitch the front, just do a tiny stitch that just catches the very edge, and that would hold that in place. You could machine stitch along the edge here just to again hold that in place. Perhaps you could use a decorative stitch as well to hold everything down and make a feature of it. But this will rescue you on those occasions when you've miscalculated and you've not got quite enough fabric left for the binding, but you do happen to have a gorgeous fabric on the back. Another way to finish a quilt is using something called a flange border. Now, a flange is basically a strip or protrusion, sometimes of metal, often in fabric, and that's what we're going to do here. So let's imagine that this is my quilt, and think of it as the binding is the frame. But then when you see some really fancy prints, or fancy looking photographs, they've often got a little bit of board inside. So you've got your image, you've got a border, and then you've got the frame. That's what the flange is. And it's a really simple technique. So what we need to do first of all is choose our flange fabric and prepare it. So I have cut some 1 inch wide strips and folded it in half and pressed it with the patterned side or the good side facing outwards, because this is what you're going to see. In this case, it's the same either side, so we're not too worried about it. But it will allow us to press this seam with the right sides facing outwards and the wrong sides together. The wider you want your flange that way, the wider you need to cut your strips. But I'm going to place my pieces and just pin them to my completed quilt sandwich. And then I'm going to get my scissors and cut the end off. And it's helpful to have them overlapping at the ends like this. You will find it a little easier to manage when you're sewing them down. So when you're trying to work out how much fabric you're actually going to need, it's just the sort of precise measurements plus an inch or so. And then so the raw edges are matching up. So the raw edges of my flange are matching up with the raw edges of my quilt. It just adds a nice detail. And I find as well, if you're working with something that's a very busy pattern and your binding is also quite busy, having a plain strip that separates them is very effective. Also, if you were perhaps everything's black and white and grey, but you put in a narrow flange border of say red, it's going to make everything pop. And you're only going to see the very edge of it because the first 1/4 of an inch is actually going to be hidden inside the binding. So here's my last piece. And then I'm going to pin that in place as well. I like to have them so that one goes under and one goes over, but to be honest, it's not hugely noticeable whatever way you do it. So this one goes over that last piece and under the next piece. Right. So what we're going to do now is go to the sewing machine with the walking foot, and I'm going to sew very close to the edge. I'm only basting this down. Now, basting is basically a big stitch that's hidden in the seam allowance. So I will extend the length of my stitch to the longest stitch my machine will do, and then I will sew all the way around the edge so that we can take those pins out before we bind it. So there we go. I've sewn all the way around. I'm just going to trim off those edges. There's a little bit of extra wadding on the side there. We can get rid of that too, just to neaten up. You can see I've stitched quite closely to the edge. Right, so we've prepared our piece. Then I'm going to get my binding. And this is traditional binding in the way that we have just bound the first sample. I'm going to chop the end off, fold again, and then I'll pop a pin in that, bring that a little bit further across. And then we're going to bind this in the traditional way, where we would sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. Now, what you do want to keep an eye on is this is a very narrow piece. So, you know, you're going to lose 1/4 inch there. If you drift too much, it's going to be quite obvious. So where I've got this little bit of white here, I'm actually going to take that off so that when I sew my binding will be perfectly laid against that edge there, so that it'll be neat. So I'm going to go back to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew with my 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way round, again stopping 1/4 inch from there and whizzing off as we have done with the first sample. And then I'll come back and show you what it looks like. And there we go. There's our finished border with the binding around the outside. Now you have two choices when it comes to stitching. If you're doing the machine method that we did earlier, you can either stitch very close to the black in this case, or you could get a matching thread and sew just inside on the purple. I tend to avoid doing that on a plain like this when the stitching might really stand out. But again, you could do something decorative in there if you want to for another finish. So basically that is 3 different ways that you can finish your quilts. So we've got a flange border in here with traditional binding around the outside. We've got a traditional binding method which you can finish by hand or by machine, and then we've got the method that allows you to bring your backing forwards onto the front when you haven't got quite enough fabric to finish it off the way you want it to. And there you go, that's your quilt finished.